The October air hung cold and heavy over the San Juan Mountains, where the first snow had already dusted the peaks white. Jacob Miller had driven up the narrow forest road in his pickup truck, the same route he'd taken every hunting season since his father first brought him here as a boy. The cabin sat at the end of a deteriorating track 5 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by lodgepole pines and aspen groves that had turned golden, then bare. It was October 12, 2007, and Jacob had told his wife Rebecca he'd be back in Durango by Sunday evening. He never made it home. Rebecca Miller waited until Monday morning before calling the La Plata County Sheriff's Office. Her husband was reliable, almost to a fault. He'd been a high school biology teacher for 12 years, the kind of man who showed up 15 minutes early to everything. When Deputy Frank Ortega took her statement, she described how Jacob had seemed distracted the week before his trip, quieter than usual. He'd packed his hunting gear mechanically, checking and rechecking his rifle twice, which wasn't like him. The last thing he'd said to her was that he needed time to think. She'd assumed he meant about his father's recent death, about the inheritance they'd received, about whether to sell the old cabin or keep it in the family. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. The search began on Tuesday. Deputy Ortega, along with 2 rangers from the San Juan National Forest and a volunteer search and rescue team, drove up to the cabin location Rebecca had marked on their map. The structure stood intact, its weathered logs dark against the snow. Jacob's truck was parked outside, keys still in the ignition. Inside, the cabin looked lived in but abandoned mid-activity. A half-eaten can of beans sat on the wooden table, a spoon resting beside it. His sleeping bag was rolled out on the narrow cot. His rifle leaned against the wall, fully loaded. His wallet, phone, and truck keys were all accounted for. What made no sense was that his boots were missing, along with his heavy coat. But his backpack, GPS device, and first aid kit remained behind. Search teams combed a 5-mile radius for the next 8 days. The terrain was unforgiving, steep slopes covered in deadfall and thick underbrush. They found no footprints, no blood, no signs of struggle. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the mountains. Cadaver dogs picked up nothing. It was as if Jacob Miller had simply stepped out of the cabin and dissolved into the wilderness. The official search was called off on October 23rd due to heavy snowfall that made the area impassable. The case remained open, but went cold within weeks. Rebecca received her husband's belongings from the cabin in a cardboard box. She couldn't bring herself to go up there herself. Over the following years, the cabin sat empty. Rebecca couldn't sell it, not without Jacob being declared legally dead, and she couldn't bear to do that. The property taxes came due each year, and she paid them quietly, a ritual of hope that felt increasingly hollow. She remarried in 2012 to a man named Brian Foster, a contractor who tried to understand her grief but couldn't quite reach it. They had a daughter, Claire, who grew up knowing she had a half-sister somewhere, Jacob's daughter from his first marriage, but the families never connected. Rebecca kept a box of Jacob's things in the garage, hidden behind Christmas decorations. She taught 4th grade and lived a careful, controlled life. She didn't talk about Jacob much, not even to Brian, especially not to Brian. The call came on April 3rd, 2025. Rebecca was grading papers when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Sheriff Linda Kwan from La Plata County identified herself and asked if Rebecca could come down to the station. There was something she needed to see. Rebecca's hands went numb. She drove the 20 minutes to the sheriff's office in a daze, Brian following in his own truck. Sheriff Kwan led them to a small conference room where a laptop sat open on the table. A young couple, hikers from Boulder named Chris and Dana Peterson, had been exploring old Forest Service roads the previous weekend. They'd stumbled onto Jacob's cabin, intrigued by its isolation. Dana had taken photos. In one of them, shot at dusk, a light glowed in the cabin's single window. A warm, yellow light, like from a kerosene lamp. Sheriff Kwan explained that the Petersons had initially thought someone was squatting in the cabin, which wasn't uncommon in remote Colorado wilderness areas, but when they'd approached, the light had gone out. They'd called out, knocked on the door, received no answer. Chris had tried the door and found it locked from the inside. They'd peered through the window but couldn't see anyone. Unnerved, they'd hiked back to their vehicle and contacted the sheriff's office the next morning. Deputy Ortega, who'd worked Jacob's disappearance 18 years earlier, had immediately recognized the location. He'd driven up there himself 2 days ago with another deputy. The cabin was locked, just as the hikers had described. They'd forced the door. What they found inside made no sense. The cabin looked almost exactly as it had in 2007, except everything had been cleaned. The can of beans was gone. The table had been wiped. The sleeping bag was still on the cot, but it had been folded neatly. Jacob's rifle was still there, still loaded in the exact same position. But there were new elements. A kerosene lamp sat on the table, recently used. You could smell the fuel. A journal lay beside it, bound in cracked leather, filled with handwriting. Sheriff Kwan slid the journal across the table to Rebecca. She recognized her husband's precise, careful script immediately. Her vision blurred with tears. The first entry was dated October 13th, 2007, the day after Jacob had arrived. Rebecca read aloud, her voice shaking. "I can't explain what I saw last night. I keep telling myself it was a dream, exhaustion, maybe carbon monoxide from the old stove. But I know what I saw. Dad was standing at the edge of the tree line. Not a bear, not a hallucination. My father, wearing the same flannel shirt he was buried in. He didn't speak. He just gestured for me to follow. I didn't. I couldn't. I locked myself in the cabin until morning. When I looked outside at dawn, there were footprints in the frost leading into the woods. I need to understand this. I can't go home until I do." The entries continued sporadically. October 14th. Followed the footprints 2 miles up the mountain. They ended at an old mine shaft I've never seen before. The entrance was partially collapsed but passable. I could hear something inside, like breathing, but deeper. I didn't go in. Came back to the cabin. Found my boots covered in red clay. There's no red clay on this mountain. October 16th. Haven't eaten in 2 days, can't leave. Every time I pack up the truck, I see him again. He's trying to tell me something. There's something in that mine. Something he wants me to find. I think it's why he bought this land 40 years ago. Not for hunting. For whatever's down there. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sheriff Kwan watched Rebecca carefully. The entries grew more erratic, the handwriting looser, more frantic. October 18th. Went into the mine today. Found a chamber about 50 feet down. There are marks on the walls, symbols I don't recognize. Old camping equipment, decades old. Food cans from the 1960s. Someone was living down there. I found bones, not animal bones. I couldn't stay. I ran back to the cabin. I need to call Rebecca, but my phone is dead, and I can't remember why I'm still here. The entries stopped on October 19th, 2007. The rest of the journal was blank, except for one final entry on a page near the back, dated differently. The handwriting was shakier, but still recognizably Jacob's. The date was March 2025, just 1 month ago. Rebecca gasped. The entry was brief. "I don't know how long it's been. Time moves differently here. I see Rebecca sometimes through the window. She doesn't see me. I think I'm between. The mine won't let me leave. I tried. Every time I walk down the mountain, I end up back at the cabin. I'm writing this because I need someone to know. Check the mine. Bring what's down there into the light. Then maybe I can go home." Sheriff Kwan let the silence settle before speaking. She told them a team was already being assembled. They'd located the mine shaft Jacob had described, using the GPS coordinates he'd sketched in the journal margins. It was on the property, about 2 miles northeast of the cabin. in an area so overgrown it wasn't on any Forest Service maps. A historical survey from 1889 listed it as the Silverton Deep Mine, abandoned after a collapse, killed 3 workers. The entrance had been deliberately concealed, filled with rocks and covered with branches. Someone had reopened it, possibly decades ago. They were bringing in experts from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit and a specialized cave rescue team. Rebecca couldn't process what she was hearing. Her husband's journal, written 18 years ago, and then again 1 month ago, describing events that defied explanation. Brian tried to comfort her, but she pulled away. She needed to go to the cabin. She needed to see this for herself. Sheriff Kwan advised against it, said the area was now a crime scene, but Rebecca was already standing. She'd waited 18 years for answers. She wasn't waiting anymore. The drive up the mountain took 3 hours. The road worse than Rebecca remembered from the descriptions. She'd never actually been to the cabin. Jacob had kept it as his private retreat, a space inherited from his father. Now, following the sheriff's department vehicles, she saw why. The forest pressed in on all sides, dense and dark even in afternoon light. They arrived at the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked smaller than she'd imagined, more fragile. The door hung open where deputies had forced it. She stepped inside, Brian close behind her. The space smelled of old wood and kerosene, the cot where Jacob had slept, the table where he'd written, the window where a light had glowed just days ago. Rebecca touched everything gently, as if the objects might disintegrate. She picked up the rifle, felt its weight. Jacob had taught her to shoot years ago, before they'd married. She'd been good at it. She set it down carefully and noticed something the deputies had missed. A small carving in the table's surface, worn smooth but still visible. Initials. J.M. plus R.M. Jacob had carved their initials here probably years ago. She traced them with her finger, tears finally coming. Sheriff Kwan entered and told them the team was ready to investigate the mine. They'd brought portable lighting, climbing gear, and forensic equipment. Rebecca insisted on being there. Kwan argued briefly, but relented when Rebecca made it clear she would follow them regardless. They hiked northeast through thick pine forest, following a trail that wasn't a trail, just a series of subtle disturbances in the undergrowth. After 40 minutes, they reached an area where the ground sloped sharply downward. Partially hidden behind fallen timber and overgrown with scrub oak, a dark opening gaped in the hillside. The cave rescue team, led by a man named Patrick Vega, set up their equipment. They ran lines into the shaft, testing air quality and stability. Patrick explained that old mines were incredibly dangerous, prone to collapse, filled with toxic gases, unstable floors. He'd lost a colleague to an abandoned mine in Leadville 3 years ago. They were taking every precaution. He descended first, his headlamp disappearing into darkness. His voice crackled over the radio. 50 feet down there was a chamber, just like Jacob had described. He needed another team member down there. Rebecca waited at the surface, pacing. Brian stood with his hands in his pockets, out of his depth. Sheriff Kwan monitored radio communication. 20 minutes passed. Then Patrick's voice came through, strained. They'd found something, not remains, something else. They were bringing it up. Another 20 minutes. Then Patrick emerged from the shaft, his face pale, holding a weathered canvas backpack. He set it down carefully on a flat rock. Inside were items wrapped in oilcloth, a metal box, several notebooks, and a leather satchel containing what looked like old surveyor's tools. Sheriff Kwan opened the metal box. Inside were documents, brittle with age. Land deeds from the 1880s, mining claims, letters, and photographs. Rebecca leaned closer. The photographs showed miners standing in front of the same cabin that now stood in the clearing. Men with stern faces and desperate eyes. In one photo, a group of 7 men stood in front of the mine entrance. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Silverton Deep Crew, July 1889, last photo before the collapse. But there was another photograph tucked beneath the others. It showed the same location, but decades later, the mine entrance partially visible. 3 people stood in front of it: a man, a woman, and a young boy. Rebecca's hands began to tremble. She knew the boy. It was Jacob, maybe 8 years old, and the man beside him was Jacob's father, Richard Miller. The notebooks told a story that Rebecca struggled to comprehend. They belonged to Richard Miller, dated from 1974 to 1981. Richard had been obsessed with the Silverton Deep Mine. He'd purchased the land not for recreation, but because he believed something was hidden down there, something valuable that had been covered up after the 1889 collapse. He'd spent years researching, interviewing descendants of the original miners, piecing together a theory. The mine hadn't collapsed accidentally. It had been deliberately destroyed to hide evidence of a discovery. Richard wrote about gold concentrations that didn't match geological surveys, about symbols carved into chamber walls that predated the mine itself, about 3 workers who'd vanished inside days before the official collapse. Richard had opened the mine in 1978. He'd gone down alone multiple times. His entries became increasingly paranoid. He wrote about feeling watched, about hearing voices, about seeing figures in the darkness that disappeared when he shone his light on them. His final entry, dated October 1981, was disturbing. "I brought Jacob up here to show him. I wanted him to understand why this matters. But when we went down together, he saw them too, the 3 miners. They're still down there. They never left. I've sealed the entrance again. I'm not coming back. If I do, I won't come out." Richard Miller died of a heart attack in 2006. He'd left the cabin to Jacob in his will. Patrick radioed again. They'd found something else in the chamber. Human remains, 3 sets, partially buried under rockfall. They appeared to be over a century old, consistent with the 1889 time period. There was no sign of Jacob, but there were recent disturbances in the chamber, marks in the dust, as if someone had been there within the past few months, fresh scratches on the walls, and one more thing, a piece of fabric snagged on a rock protrusion. Patrick brought it up. It was a torn section of a jacket, faded brown canvas. Rebecca recognized it immediately. It was from the coat Jacob had been wearing when he disappeared, the one that had gone missing from the cabin 18 years ago. The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 weeks. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation took over the case, treating it as both a historical find and an active missing person investigation. The 3 sets of remains found in the mine were identified through dental records and genealogical research as the 3 workers who'd vanished in July 1889, just before the official collapse. Their families had searched for them for decades, believing they'd abandoned their posts and fled. Now, over a century later, they could finally be laid to rest. The mine itself was documented, photographed, and then permanently sealed. But Jacob's case remained unsolved. The fabric from his coat proved he'd been in the mine chamber at some point. The journal entries suggested he'd been there in October 2007, and possibly again as recently as March 2025. But there were no other remains, no evidence of what had happened to him, no explanation for the entries dated 18 years after his disappearance. The forensic team tested the journal thoroughly. The handwriting matched Jacob's exemplars. The paper was consistent throughout, from a single notebook. The ink from the October 2007 entries and the March 2025 entry showed no significant aging difference, which made no sense. Either someone had forged the later entry, or Jacob had written both sections around the same time. Rebecca became obsessed with finding answers. She hired a private investigator, a retired FBI agent named Grace Chen, who specialized in cold cases. Grace approached it methodically. She interviewed everyone connected to the case: the Peterson couple, who'd seen the light in the cabin; Deputy Ortega, who'd worked the original search; neighbors who'd known Jacob and Richard Miller. She tracked down people who'd worked with Richard in the 1970s, who'd known about his mine obsession. One elderly woman, a former secretary at Richard's surveying company, remembered him talking about time slips and thin places where the boundary between past and present wore thin. Richard had believed the mine was one of those places. Grace also looked into the Silverton Deep Mine's history. She found newspaper articles from 1889 describing the collapse, the search for the missing workers, and conspiracy theories that had circulated at the time. Some locals had claimed the mine had tapped into something it shouldn't have, that strange lights had been seen emanating from the shaft at night, that workers had reported hearing voices that seemed to come from the stone itself. The mining company had dismissed these claims as superstition and exhaustion, but after the collapse they'd never attempted to reopen the site, despite evidence of rich ore deposits. The land had been sold off quickly, passing through several owners before Richard Miller purchased it in 1974. The most troubling discovery came from Grace's forensic analysis of the cabin itself. She brought in a team to document every detail using techniques unavailable in 2007. They found fingerprints throughout the cabin, most belonging to Jacob, dated through residue analysis to October 2007. But they also found a second set of Jacob's prints, chemically distinct, that were only weeks old. On the kerosene lamp, on the journal, on the door latch. Grace showed Rebecca the report, her expression grim. Either someone had planted evidence using preserved samples of Jacob's fingerprints, which seemed absurdly complex, or Jacob Miller had been in that cabin within the past month. Rebecca couldn't sleep. She lay awake next to Brian night after night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of impossible things. Jacob alive after 18 years, trapped somehow, aging differently, experiencing time in a way that defied physics. Or Jacob dead, and someone staging an elaborate hoax, but for what purpose? There was no inheritance to claim, no insurance payout. The cabin was worthless, the land remote and unbuildable. Who would go to such lengths, and why? She started having dreams about the mine, about walking down into darkness and finding Jacob standing there, unchanged, asking why she'd taken so long to find him. In late April, Rebecca made a decision. She told Brian she needed to spend the night in the cabin, alone. He objected strenuously, said it was dangerous, irrational, that she was torturing herself. But Rebecca was beyond listening. Grace offered to go with her, to monitor from a vehicle parked nearby. Rebecca agreed to that compromise. On April 28, 2025, 18 years and 6 months after Jacob's disappearance, Rebecca Miller drove up the mountain road to the cabin. She brought the journal, a kerosene lamp, and a sleeping bag. Grace parked 50 yards away, maintaining radio contact. The cabin felt different at night. The forest sounds pressed close, animal calls and wind through pine branches. Rebecca lit the kerosene lamp, its warm glow pushing back the darkness. She sat at the table where Jacob had written, where he'd carved their initials. She opened the journal and read through the entries again, searching for details she might have missed. The description of seeing his father, the footprints, the mine, the symbols on the walls. The feeling of being trapped, of time looping back on itself. She read the final entry, dated March 2025, over and over. I see Rebecca sometimes through the window. She doesn't see me. She looked at the window. Outside, darkness. Inside, her reflection in the glass, illuminated by lamplight. She thought about quantum mechanics, about the multiverse theories Jacob had loved discussing, about string theory and parallel dimensions. He'd been a science teacher, fascinated by the strange implications of modern physics. He'd once told her that reality might be far more fluid than we assume, that time might not be the rigid line we experience it as. She'd laughed, accused him of reading too much science fiction. Now she wondered if he'd known something, if his father had told him something, if the mine had shown him something that had shattered his understanding of how the world worked. Hours passed. Rebecca dozed fitfully at the table, her head on her arms. She woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Her heart hammered. She grabbed the radio. "Grace, did you hear that?" Static. Then Grace's voice. "Hear what? I didn't hear anything." The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Rebecca stood, moving to the window. She cupped her hands against the glass, trying to see outside. Nothing. Just darkness. Then a figure at the edge of the lamplight's reach. Tall, male, wearing a dark coat. It stood motionless, facing the cabin. Rebecca's breath caught. She grabbed the flashlight Grace had given her and shone it through the window. The beam illuminated empty forest. No one there. She swept the light back and forth. Nothing. But when she turned off the flashlight, letting her eyes readjust, the figure was there again. Standing in the same spot. She understood suddenly. It only appeared in lamplight, in the kerosene lamp's specific frequency. She moved the lamp closer to the window. The figure became clearer. It was Jacob, or something wearing Jacob's face. The same face she'd kissed goodbye 18 years ago, unchanged, unaged. She didn't scream. She didn't call for Grace. She just stared. Jacob stared back. Then he raised his hand and pointed toward the northeast, toward the mine. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear. She pressed her ear against the window. Faintly, impossibly, she heard his voice, distorted as if traveling through water. "I couldn't leave them alone down there. Someone had to stay. Tell Claire I'm sorry." Then he turned and walked into the darkness, his form dissipating like smoke. Rebecca ran outside, the kerosene lamp in her hand. Grace's voice crackled on the radio, asking what was happening. Rebecca ignored her, running toward where Jacob had stood. The ground showed no footprints. She kept going, crashing through undergrowth, heading northeast toward the sealed mine. The lamp's flame guttered in the wind, but didn't go out. Behind her, she heard Grace shouting, running after her. She didn't stop. She reached the mine location, where the entrance had been filled with concrete and steel bars, officially closed. The lamp's light fell across the sealed entrance, and there, scratched into the fresh concrete, still wet enough to mark, were 3 words in Jacob's handwriting. "They're at peace." Rebecca sank to her knees. Grace caught up, breathing hard, trying to understand what she was seeing. Rebecca explained what had happened, knowing how insane it sounded. Grace examined the concrete. It had been poured 3 weeks ago. She'd been there when the sealing crew finished. It should be fully cured, impossible to mark. Yet the words were there, fresh, undeniable. Grace made calls. By morning, a team was back at the site. They removed a section of the concrete seal and sent cameras down into the chamber. The 3 sets of remains they'd documented before were gone. Not moved, not disturbed. Gone. The chamber was empty except for the old camping equipment and the symbols on the walls. The team documented everything again, confirming their previous photos. The remains had been there 3 weeks ago. Now they weren't. The forensic anthropologist had no explanation. Grace had no explanation. Sheriff Kwan reopened the case file and added a note. Unexplained circumstances. Recommend no further action. Rebecca returned home to Durango in a state of numb acceptance. She couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't rationalize it into a form that made sense. But she knew what she'd seen. Jacob had been there. He'd stayed in that mine somehow for 18 years, watching over the remains of 3 men who died over a century ago. And once those remains had been found and removed, once the families had been notified and the miners properly laid to rest, Jacob had been released, or he'd released himself, or something had released him. The specific mechanics didn't matter. What mattered was that he was gone, truly gone, and he'd wanted her to know he was at peace. She tried to explain it to Brian, who listened with the strained patience of someone who loves you but thinks you've experienced a trauma-induced breakdown. She tried to explain it to Claire, now 13, who asked thoughtful questions about time and space and whether her father might have been stuck in a loop, living the same moments over and over. Claire understood in a way Brian couldn't. She'd grown up with ghost stories and mystery, with a missing person whose absence had shaped her mother's entire adult life. She accepted that reality might contain more strangeness than their daily experience suggested. Grace continued investigating for another month before closing her case file. She'd exhausted every rational avenue: the fingerprints, the journal entries, the fabric, the eyewitness accounts. None of it added up to a coherent explanation. She wrote in her final report, "Jacob Miller entered the Silverton Deep Mine on October 13, 2007. The evidence suggests he encountered something in that mine that trapped him in a localized temporal distortion. Whether this distortion was psychological, physical, or something beyond current scientific understanding cannot be determined. As of April 28, 2025, Jacob Miller is presumed deceased. The case is closed." The story leaked to local media in May. A journalist from the Durango Herald wrote an article, "The Mystery of the Cabin Light, Missing Teacher's Strange Legacy." It was picked up by regional outlets, then by national true crime podcasts. Rebecca declined all interview requests. She didn't want Jacob's disappearance to become entertainment, dissected by strangers who hadn't known him, who hadn't loved him. She sold the cabin and the land to the U.S. Forest Service for $1, with the stipulation that the mine remain permanently sealed and the cabin be dismantled. The Forest Service agreed. By June, the structure was gone, the clearing beginning its slow reclamation by wilderness. Rebecca kept the journal. She kept the photographs of Richard Miller and young Jacob standing in front of the mine. She kept the piece of fabric from Jacob's coat. She put them in a box with their wedding album and letters Jacob had written her during their courtship. She told Claire that when she was older, when she was ready, she could read the journal and decide for herself what it meant. Claire said she already knew what it meant. It meant that some people get lost in ways that can't be mapped, that reality has edges where things get strange, and that love persists even when presence doesn't. In July, Rebecca received a package. No return address. Inside was a photograph she'd never seen before. It showed the cabin taken from the tree line, probably in the 1980s. Richard Miller stood on the porch, and beside him, a young Jacob, maybe 10 years old. They were both looking directly at the camera, unsmiling. On the back, in Richard's handwriting, "Some places remember, some places don't let go. If you're reading this, you already know." Rebecca didn't know who had sent it or how they'd obtained it. She added it to the box with the other items. She never went back to the mountains. She stayed in Durango, teaching, raising Claire, building a life with Brian that was quiet and normal and free of mysteries. But sometimes, on October nights when the air turned cold, she would stand at her bedroom window and look toward the dark line of the San Juan Mountains. She would think about thin places and time slips, about miners trapped in darkness and teachers who couldn't leave them alone. She would think about a kerosene lamp burning in an empty cabin, a light that shouldn't exist but did, visible only to those who knew to look. And she would whisper into the darkness, "I see you, Jacob. I see you." Not because she believed he could hear her, but because some acts of remembering are their own form of presence. Because love doesn't end when someone disappears. It just changes shape, becomes a different kind of light. And sometimes, if you're patient, if you're willing to sit in the darkness long enough, that light is enough to find your way home.